little more serious. Okay, thanks everyone. Welcome to the session 4 of our online adaptation planning and practices training for spring of September or spring of 2023. We're going to get moving here because this is, I think, one of the most exciting steps of the adaptation workbook, probably something that you all have been anticipating the entire time you got into this course and have been either looking forward to, or maybe you've actually been peeking ahead and working on this section all along. Just a reminder that this lecture is being recorded. You just heard the recording of this will be shared on our YouTube page along with all the other course materials. We held a special session just to explain our NIACS adaptation menus earlier this morning. That was also recorded and will be posted here as well. And an email will be forthcoming with links and slides for all of these materials. So session 4 is all about identifying adaptation strategies, approaches, and tactics. Like I said, probably something that you all have been looking forward to this entire time since you signed up. I'm going to be starting this lecture, and then Courtney Peterson will be picking up the second half, sharing some examples. As always, feel free to reach out to any of us on the instructor list, starting with your primary point of contact if you have questions about any of this material, working through the actual button pushing process of the online workbook, or anything, any other way we can be of help for your project. So we're going to do a brief recap of step 3. We'll talk a little bit about some broader context for climate change adaptation, lay out a spectrum of choices to make sure you all kind of have the full scope of opportunity available to you in your head before you proceed with this step. And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of step 4 of the adaptation workbook, including your assignment for next week. So you made good use of your catch-up week last week. I know it. So you're all caught up with steps 1, 2, and 3 of the adaptation workbook. So congratulations. Just as a quick reminder, step 3 was that opportunity to do kind of a gut check and a rigorous examination of the management goals and objectives that you started with in step 1. So after considering climate change impacts and vulnerabilities and the unique site conditions of your project area in step 2, step 3 was that chance to actually say, one by one, for all of your management objectives, am I confident that business as usual management is going to be able to help me carry forward and accomplish the objective that I set out with? And that's a really critical point of this workbook, that we really examine business as usual. We really examine the status quo. Like we've talked about, use this adaptation workbook as kind of a scripted conversation that you can have with your peers, with your supervisors, or with the public. And step 3 is really the center of your rationale of, yes, I am confident I can still meet my objective, or I'm not that confident I can still meet my objective, and therefore I might need to do some new or additional adaptation actions. So you need to have that rationale clearly spelled out. And step 3 is your chance to do that and then to really show your work. Here's how I've thought about our business as usual management and why it might fall short or why it might be fine for some of these objectives. After you've done that, after you've really kicked the tires on business as usual management, or your standard or conventional management, however you want to term it. Now we can open up the box a little bit and have more freedom to be creative, to brainstorm, and to think about what might we need to do differently? How might we proceed and address these climate change impacts, take advantage of opportunities that are out there, and continue meeting our goals and objectives? So now is your opportunity to be creative and think more broadly about what you might do differently to account for climate change. As a part of this, we're going to be relying on those menus of adaptation strategies and approaches that Courtney and I discussed this morning. So key questions for this step. What actions can enhance the ability of the project area to adapt to anticipated challenges or anticipated changes and to meet management goals? So what actions can you take now to help you meet your management goals? And it might be mysterious for some of you. It might not always be a straight line. But our NIACS adaptation menus can help you get started. If it seems like kind of a mystery right now, how you might even begin to adapt to some of the challenges that are out there, some of the climate change impacts facing some of your projects might seem a little daunting. There might not always be a clear roadmap of what's even possible to account for some of these impacts. And so that's why I think taking this course and doing this in kind of a guided fashion will give you all an opportunity to ask those questions if you're feeling a little lost about where to begin. And also our NIACS tools and adaptation menus should be a comforting and useful resource to all of you. So you heard us talk about this morning, but in case you didn't, we should make it clear that NIACS has published a collection of adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. The ones you see here on the left-hand side of your screen are the ones that have been integrated directly into the online workbook. And I think that this list will cover many of you, most of you, but there are a few adaptation menus that have not yet been integrated into the online workbook. And so if you have a particular interest in these topics, you are going to have to do some copy and paste from an external PDF in order to build those ideas in. And that includes our tribal adaptation menu that integrates tribal and indigenous perspectives, our fire adapted ecosystems menu. So if some of you are working really in a disturbance-driven environment, or if you're really planning on prescribed fire actions or fuels reduction being a big part of your project, we'll steer you to that menu. And then also we have a hot off the press adaptation menu that just focuses on Great Lakes coastal ecosystems. Those of you who are working in coastal environments in the Great Lakes, this one will be a nice supplement for you as well. I think we have one or two grasslands folks out there. Also, I should mention that we do have a grasslands menu that is in draft form, and we're happy to share that draft with you. So you already heard me hype this session a couple of times. Some of you were here that experienced it live. And we covered more detail about what are these adaptation menus, how can you use them, why were they built the way they are. And so if you're at all lost or needing a reminder about any of that, I'd encourage you to, we'll be sending out a link to that YouTube recording later today. In terms of general concepts that we want everyone to be familiar with, this is worth reiterating also from the morning. But often a big part of our role at NIACS is to make sure that you all as project leaders and project proponents are considering the full range of choices that are available to you. So we at NIAX are not advocating for any particular adaptation outcome. We're not champions of assisted migration. We're not champions of, hybrid tree research or a certain kind of road infrastructure upgrades. So you're not going to hear that from us about what is the right thing to do in all situations. Instead, our role, and really the purpose of these adaptation menus, is to make sure that you all are considering your full range of choices. And typically in kind of a land management context, in the history of published literature so far on climate adaptation, you'll often hear climate adaptation actions being sorted into three general concepts or three options that we call them as kind of highest conceptual level of ways to respond to climate change risks. And so we put those three main adaptation options on the screen here: resistance, resilience, and transition. And this is important because some of you may have come in with kind of a preconceived notion of what is climate adaptation, what am I expected to do, what's maybe the most comfortable way forward for your project. So maybe you have already kind of mentally categorized yourself into one of these pathways. And it's important now, before you really get too far into the weeds of step 4 in the adaptation workbook, to take a step back and to think about how maybe more than one pathway might apply to you and your project. It's an opportunity to ask yourself some pointed questions and to maybe get out of your comfort zone temporarily, to think about, are there opportunities here where I really need to or should try to resist change as long as possible? If I'm dealing with a system that has high social value, economic value, ecological value, maybe habitat for a rare or threatened species that needs to be preserved at all costs, right? Those are great opportunities and rationales for doing more of a resistance mindset. Resilience is something that's going to be comfortable to many of us. Many land managers are already kind of really coached up strongly in this resilience mentality, and that is hedging your bets, spreading risk, keeping all the pieces and parts and structures and variability that is already kind of naturally available to your ecosystem or place, so that you can experience some sort of stress or impact and the system can reassemble and it can come back to its former identity kind of on its own because you've kept so many pieces and parts. And then there's this transition idea at the far end of the spectrum. Oftentimes this is what people have pre-assumed, that climate adaptation means transition, and that is not always the case. There are certainly good opportunities and rationales out there for doing transition and intentionally encouraging a change in a system to reduce long-term climate change risks. I use the little road sign here for trees because people are often thinking about new species that might be suitable in an area given future climate projections. But it's important to note that there are also kind of gradations of transition. You can also be looking at maybe softer forms of transition, like keeping a same species but using a new seed source, encouraging a new genetic material in an area. That's an example of transition, even though at the species level it might remain constant. And transition doesn't just have to be tree choices, right? It can apply to infrastructure, public involvement and access and visitation to an area, different habitats you're encouraging, whatever the case may be. So anything you can do to intentionally encourage change that you think is going to be better positioned for the long term. So making sure you're considering all those possibilities equally at the start of this step 4 experience, I think will serve you well. There's a more detailed YouTube video about using or kind of discussing these larger climate adaptation concepts. I think that'll be in one of the like one of the curriculum emails that you all get from us. This is supplemental material. It's also in your course syllabus. And in terms of generating that storyline, like I mentioned, you heard me talk a lot about challenges and opportunities and the rationale here, or either why business as usual management can carry forward or why you may need to do adaptation. Just to illustrate how this step continues you down that pathway. So as you've decided you are going to continue and identify adaptation actions for your project, step 4 helps you get more specific and further down the path, because you're going to be finding adaptation options that are appropriate for your project and your context. You're going to be then using the adaptation menus to sort that general concept and to kind of turn it into something more specific by selecting adaptation strategies and approaches from the menus. And then that is a springboard for you to write your own tactics that will be implemented. And that means the onus is on you all to write all the details about how an action will be implemented, where it will be implemented, what tools and timing will you use to implement that action. So that final step of specificity comes from your head and your experience. The adaptation menus get you further along the pathway by helping you clarify your options, strategies, and approaches. And from our years of combined experience at NIAX, having climate adaptation discussions with different project leaders in a whole variety of ecosystems and a whole variety of contexts, something that is reinforced again and again is that climate adaptation does not have to look different than the management you're already doing. And so this is also something to really be on the lookout for before you get into step 4, is that there are probably management actions you're already doing or that are already common practice that also support adaptation. And so you may find ideas in the menus that sound like things you're already doing or that lead you to those ideas. Be sure to stop and take credit for those. Be sure to stop and write those down. Because many of the actions in your final adaptation plan may be things that you're already doing. And that's okay. That's really a hopeful outcome. But also, we know in any project, there's always a slice of actions that are small tweaks to common practice, and then maybe a smaller slice that are ideas that are really outside of the box, things that have not been considered before and that maybe occurred to you for the first time when you're looking at the adaptation menus. And the size of these wedges will be different for every project. But the point is, you should probably have items in all of these categories. So be sure to take credit for things you're already doing or that already are common practice that you want to continue, if you can justify how they benefit climate adaptation. Don't be afraid to wordsmith and make small adjustments to any of those common practices, and then keep your radar up for new and different ideas. So that's the overview conceptually of the step. What the step is going to ask you to do is to basically generate your list of adaptation approaches and tactics. And so the adaptation approaches for all of the management topics that you have created, you're going to be sorting through our NIACS adaptation menus that are available to you, or copying in new ideas from our external PDFs. You'll be selecting approaches that are kind of predefined for you. And then you'll be presented with a series of pop-up boxes that help you articulate all the technical details. The what, the where, the how. So be prepared to spend a lot of time on this step writing tactics and to make them as detailed as possible. And in that tactics box, be prepared to think about the time frame when you're going to implement these things as well. And that can be like if things are up, happening multiple times, or just at a certain time of the year, or in a sequence of events that are scheduled over a longer term in your project. There will also be opportunities for you to weigh the benefits associated with an adaptation tactic. So for example, if something is cheap and easy, or if doing this adaptation tactic has benefits outside of climate adaptation. For example, here, if it's also contributing to environmental justice outcomes, that's something noteworthy to mention when you're weighing whether or not this is an action worth taking. On the flip side, we ask you to think about potential drawbacks and barriers associated with any of the adaptation tactics that you're brainstorming. And so this is a chance to document which things might be very costly, which things might involve a learning curve, which things might put you in conflict with other goals or outcomes, or that have trade-offs associated with them. But the point here is that we're asking you to weigh these drawbacks and barriers because we want you to brainstorm and don't be bashful about like self-censoring ideas. So you can put ideas in the workbook, and then ultimately you can scrutinize them, and you can choose not to implement them. You can choose not to carry them forward. So you can use this as kind of the record keeping for, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Did you think about this? Yes, we thought about it, and here's why I decided to carry forward, or here's why I decided, well, maybe this adaptation action isn't a good fit for my project. So you can use this to really show your work about all the adaptation actions you considered. We'll be asking you this question about whether something is practicable. Is it effective and feasible? That's a separate question from benefits and drawbacks. And then at the end, you get to put the stamp of approval on, yes, I'm going to recommend this adaptation tactic, or no, I won't. And so ideally, you'll all generate a really long list of adaptation tactics, and there will be a subset of them that you don't recommend. And that doesn't have to be time wasted. That can be time that is useful, because then you'll be able to talk about that with your peers, with your supervisors, or with the public. Okay, so you've heard enough from me. Now let's kick it to Courtney. And Courtney, would you like me to advance these slides, or would you like to share from your own end?
I can switch and share from my end. Thanks, Stephen.
Sure.
While we do the switch, does anyone have any questions for Stephen about step 4 and how it works with the adaptation workbook? Awesome. Nice and clear. Thanks, Stephen. All right, so now what we want to do is just provide an example of what this can look like for different projects on the ground. So one project we decided to highlight is from our Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, or the ASK network, where we are intentionally testing resistance, resilience, and transition strategies in different forests across the US and Canada. And so for this, for your projects, you probably will not pick all resistance, resilience, and transition. If you do, that's great, but you might end up on one end of the spectrum or another, depending on how you want to achieve your management goals and objectives. With this example, we're intentionally thinking about what does this look like for all three of those different adaptation concepts. And so this is from our Crosby Farm Regional Park example, which is in the middle of the Twin Cities in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it's part of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is a national park within the city of St. Paul. And so it's basically a 736-acre park. It's within this urban corridor. It's a floodplain forest, and it is a very highly visited recreation area for people who live within the St. Paul area. And so it's again, part of this floodplain forest that's dominated by ash and elm and cottonwoods, and provides that outdoor destination with over 6.7 miles of paved trails, hunting, fishing, bird watching, canoeing, boating, and winter recreation opportunities as well. All right, so some of the management goals, thinking about step one for Crosby Farm. They really wanted to have that diverse, stratified canopy. They're really thinking about how do we encourage natural regeneration of different age classes, particularly of this ash elm canopy, which is being hit really hard by emerald ash borer. How do we make sure we have diverse habitat for wildlife? It's a key migratory flyway. Bald eagles love to nest in this area, and there's a lot of opportunities for pollinator habitat within the city. They also want to focus on cottonwood regeneration, again, for that eagle habitat and nesting trees. And they want to focus on how do we make sure we have some of this bluff trail restoration and prevent some of that soil erosion and control, especially as we start to experience some of these extreme flooding events in this forest along this river area. And there's also some challenges with invasive species, again, emerald ash borer, some invasive vines, and bush honeysuckle, which is starting to outcompete some of that understory vegetation. So we're really thinking about how do we frame these as our overarching management goals, and how do we continue to achieve these as we're implementing our different adaptation tactics at Crosby Farm. I think I skipped a slide. There we go. All right, so some of the overarching climate change impacts that we're dealing with. There's warmer temperatures in the Twin Cities, especially at nighttime in both the summer and the winter. So we're really starting to think about how do these lack of freezing temperatures really influence this forest ecosystem in the Twin Cities. We're also experiencing those heavier rain events and flooding events. When we all came together to do this workshop to come up with the treatments for Crosby Farm, it had actually flooded, so we couldn't even access the site. So this is a picture from one of those flooding events that's completely taken over the trail through the middle of Crosby Farm. We're also experiencing at the same time of that, as we're getting those flooding events, we're experiencing more drought stress in the summer. So it's this tandem of what we're dealing with how do we handle extreme flooding, but also it's not saturating into the soil, it's creating erosion, and we're experiencing drought. We're also seeing decreases in the snow water equivalent, which has implications for the rivers. We also are seeing shifts in hardiness zones from a 5 to a 6. So that climate for St. Paul is going to be more similar to that of Omaha, Nebraska by the end of the century. And we're starting to experience some of these extreme events, such as the polar vortex and those extremely low temperatures in the winter. And again, those invasive species considerations with some of those understory plants outcompeting the native vegetation and regeneration. So that led us to think about what are some of those different challenges and opportunities for achieving those management goals of that diverse stratified canopy, cottonwood habitat, maintaining ash and elm. And so some of those key climate challenges or tree species currently found in the park are expected to see that reduced habitat suitability under climate change, including things like northern white cedar, black willow, silver maple, cottonwood, and box elder. And so those are some of those less dominant but native species found at Crosby Farm that we're expecting to see reduced habitat suitability. Also, those ash species are declining due to emerald ash borer and are expected to largely disappear from the forest canopy. So they've been hit pretty hard by emerald ash borer, and we're really starting to see those pockets appear in the canopy where those ash trees used to be. However, there are some opportunities. So there are some tree species that are expected to have increased habitat suitability under climate change, including things like fir oak, swamp white oak, hackberry, American elm, and red mulberry. So again, some of those less dominant native species are projected to have that increase in suitability, as well as some things that are currently found in a similar floodplain forest ecosystem in southern Minnesota and Iowa. So farther down along the Mississippi River corridor, there's again those species that we think will have increased habitat suitability, such as honey locust, sycamore, and swamp white oak. All right, so what we ended up coming up with, we used the forest menu of adaptation strategies and approaches, and we thought about this in terms primarily of these species within this urban forest for these strategy examples. And so for resistance, we decided for our approach, we're going to prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and try to remove those existing invasives where they're present. So what we really want to do is go in and do a lot of site prep, make sure we're reducing that competition, getting rid of that bush honeysuckle, and making room for that natural regeneration of those native species, and then going in and planting where needed to supplement that natural regeneration. We also wanted to go and scout and treat and remove those invasive plant populations. So doing a little bit of herbicide of those invasive species to try to make sure that we're preventing them from outcompeting that regeneration. For resilience, what we decided to do was try to favor or restore those native species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. So we really wanted to think about how can we start to incorporate genotypes of those native species currently on site that are adapted to those warmer temperatures. So we want a broader range of those flood adaptive species that are native to Minnesota and northern Iowa, so part of this Mississippi River corridor. So we started to plant things like silver maple, American elm, cottonwood, and black willow, as well as river birch and bur oak and sycamore and swamp white oak that are all coming from nurseries from plant hardiness zones that are a 5. Plus silver maples coming from a zone 4. So again, thinking about there's going to be that shift to that hardiness zone that's similar to Omaha, Nebraska. So how can we start to increase the genetic adaptiveness of our native species by pulling these native species, but from those different USDA plant hardiness zone nurseries. And then finally, with transition, we're introducing species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. So we have both native and some assisted migration for our transition treatment, where we're really thinking about how do we have these population expansions and promote a broad suite of future adapted species from both flood tolerant and drought tolerant seed zones farther along the Mississippi. So we're starting to think, how can we start to shift the species composition to something that's more along the lines of southern Iowa and Missouri? So even farther down the river, how can we start to shift to those more flood and drought tolerant species that are going to be more adapted to some of those future conditions at the end of the century? So bringing in things like river birch and sweet gum and southern pin oak and tulip poplar from that USDA plant hardiness zone 6 nurseries. So again, pulling from Iowa and Missouri nurseries with those plantings. So those are just some examples of tactics and how they kind of fit across that adaptation spectrum from resistance, maintaining what's there, to transition where we're facilitating that change to a condition we think will be adapted at the end of the century to those extreme climate events. And then of course, we're doing lots of monitoring. So we're taking overstory measurements, looking at the species, their height and their health for anything greater than 5 inches DBH. We're also looking at the seedlings and saplings that we planted and looking at their species, size class, and any potential forest health concerns, doing lots of phenology measurements with all of these species and these trees that we're planting. We're also looking at what's going on in the herbaceous layer. How are those site prep treatments doing with getting rid of that herbaceous competitors and invasive species? How much down deadwood is there, especially as we're seeing these canopy gaps created with dead ash in the overstory, and how is that affecting the understory? And then looking at soil moisture and microclimate conditions as well, and how is that interacting with the seedlings that are being planted on site. And then a big part of this project is community engagement. And so one of the goals of the Crosby Farm Ask site was to really create an educated, engaged public that's involved in local climate adaptation efforts. So since this is right in the middle of St. Paul, there's a ton of volunteers who have come out to help with this site. They've done a lot of the understory treatments. We experienced a drought the summer after we planted all of the seedlings. And so we had volunteers who were out there watering to make sure all of the planted seedlings were able to survive during that drought. So volunteers have been a really important part of this project. Also, since it's in the middle of the Twin Cities, it's a great chance to really have those interpretive signs and really share what we're doing as far as climate adaptation goes and some of these different strategies that we're trying. So we have interpretive signs that are both in English and the Dakota language that are displayed for the resistance, resilience, and transition treatments. And so that was an awesome collaboration with the North Hennepin Community College to create those signs. And then finally, there's been a lot of opportunities to engage K through 12 students in all of this work as well. So it's a great learning forest for students in the area. There's tons of field trips that take place here, and they can be involved in planting and monitoring as well. So that's one example, thinking about how we picked and chose those different adaptation tactics for this site. They were very planting focused, so yours hopefully will span the gambit, but really, again, focus back on your goals and your objectives and your climate impacts and how you want to address those with the tactics that you choose. So finally, we just want to wrap up with some tips for navigating the adaptation workbook online. So for this step, you're really going to be reviewing all of those different menus of strategies and approaches. There's shortcut buttons that are embedded within the adaptation workbook that'll take you to those lists and those menus with the strategies and approaches for each menu that's been incorporated and embedded within the workbook. And so that's a chance for you to go view those and play around and explore and really start to boost your creativity with what you're thinking about from each of these different menus. And you can choose from any of them when you're selecting your strategies and approaches, and then use that to come up with your prescriptive tactics. You're also going to want to make sure you associate a tactic to your objectives, and you'll have a chance to know where it's relevant to your objectives and where it's not within the workbook. And then determine, as Stephen said, whether or not you're going to recommend that tactic and why. So you're really documenting your thought process of, we did explore this potential opportunity as a tactic, but it doesn't make sense because of capacity or funding or different implementation challenges that we're going to run into. So when you enter the adaptation workbook, you'll go to step 4, make sure you use your little carrots to navigate around the screen. And what you'll see is this list of the different menus of strategies and approaches. And so you can click on any of them and it'll open up a new browser or tab, and you can look through the menu and the strategies and approaches for each of those different menus. And then the key button you're going to want to focus on is that Add a Tactic button. So you'll click on that and it'll pop up another box. And this is where you'll really go through and you can say, all right, here's the menu I chose. Here's the strategy I want to use. Here's the approach that I've chosen, and then enter the details for your tactic. So again, this is where you come up with the particular details for your tactic based on your set of characteristics and local conditions. And you can pull from some of the examples from the menus as well. So don't forget to use those if you need help. But this is where you'll enter those details. And then you can also include, what are the benefits of this tactic? What are the drawbacks of this tactic? And will you recommend it or not? Make sure you hit save so that it adds the tactic. And then when you're done, once you've got all of your tactics added, you can go through and recommend or not recommend each tactic for your objectives. So it'll have your long list of objectives, and then you'll basically say for each tactic, are you recommending this tactic for this objective or not? And if not, there is a space for you to go in and say why you chose not to recommend this particular tactic. And then don't forget, there are the tutorials that are embedded within the adaptation workbook. So if you get stuck at any point, those are a great resource. And if you can't figure out how to get to the right screen, make sure you're looking for those carrots to get different tabs out of the way so that you're able to actually go in and input the information that you want to. So between now and next week, continue to wrap up step 3 as needed. Watch that presentation on adaptation concepts that Stephen mentioned that really goes into those details about what is resistance versus resilience versus transition. Complete step 4, identify your adaptation actions, and then complete the homework that's after section 4. And then don't forget to check out the training syllabus where you can view that presentation on adaptation concepts, go back and review the menus and browse different adaptation demonstrations. And then looking ahead, next week, we have just our normal lecture on Monday, April 24th. And Luke and Adrian are going to be walking us through step 5, which is monitoring and evaluating effectiveness of all of these tactics and actions you're going to pick this week. And so don't forget, we got lucky today to see everybody twice. Next week, it'll just be the one lecture. And then if you missed the special session this morning, you can always go back and watch that. The link to the video was included in the newsletter that already was sent out. And I think that's all we have. So with that, we can stick around and answer any questions. But otherwise, good luck starting to come up with your adaptation actions.
Thanks, Courtney. Lucia had a question in the chat that I'll ask you. Do you recommend mixing and matching menus, or is it better to stick with one or two?
I think it depends on your preference. We encourage, depending on your goals and objectives, if you have one that's focused on recreation and then another that's really focused on cultural perspectives, mixing and matching menus can be really helpful, and then picking and choosing what works. But really make sure you start with what are your management goals and objectives, and then go from there for picking the menus that work best for you. Stephen, any other tips you'd add to that?
Just to keep anyone from feeling overwhelmed, I guess rest assured there's usually one that is like where you'll probably get many or most of your ideas. So don't feel compelled like, oh, I've got to use 4 adaptation menus or I'll be, a slacker in this course. If you can get through one, great. If you can get through 2, even better. There's probably diminishing returns after that. Just to keep yourself and your ideas contained for this training.
Go ahead,
What
Alan.
about the tribal menu? How are we going to be able to take a look at that?
We can include links to all of those, to the tribal menu, to the Great Lakes menu, to the Fire Adapted Ecosystems menu in our course newsletter, so that you have links to them at your fingertips.
Yeah, and actually, Alan, the links are provided in that special session newsletter that I just sent out this morning. I listed all of the menus and you can directly find them there.
All right, thank you.